My entitled sister mocked my birthday gift, tried to buy my apartment behind my back, and when her plan got exposed, I never thought a simple birthday gift could shatter whatever fragile peace existed in my family, but that's exactly what happened. It all started when I spent days trying to choose something thoughtful yet practical for my younger sister, Brianna. After all, she had always been the one who seemed impossible to please, the one who found fault even in the most well-intentioned gesture. Last Christmas, during one of those forced, overly cheerful family gatherings, my father had suggested that we cap all our gifts at $75. The room had been filled with nodding heads and relieved smiles because, frankly, no one was in a position to waste money. Brianna herself had chimed in enthusiastically, saying that she was saving up for a new car and was glad to avoid unnecessary expenses. With that agreement still fresh in my mind, I chose a delicate silver bracelet for her birthday, something that cost just under $75. The bracelet featured a small charm with the letter B engraved on it. I thought the personal touch would make her smile, or at least spare me from her usual critiques. I wrapped it in paper the color of pale lavender, which I knew was her favorite, and tucked it into my bag, hoping it would bring a moment of peace between us. That afternoon, I made the 40-minute drive from my apartment in Boston to my parents' house in Brookline. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed at least a dozen cars parked along the street, an indicator that Brianna had turned her birthday dinner into a full-blown event. Brianna had always thrived on attention, and I should have known this night would be no different. My mother greeted me at the door, pulling me into a hug that smelled like perfume and rosemary from whatever she'd been cooking. She whispered that Brianna had been asking for me and urged me inside before stepping back to welcome the next guests. The house was buzzing with conversation and clinking glasses. Brianna spotted me from across the room and waved, her blonde hair styled perfectly, her smile bright as ever. She had always been the star, the one who made everyone laugh, the one people gravitated toward. I loved her, I truly did, but it was exhausting living in her shadow, where my efforts were invisible, and my accomplishments somehow always measured against hers. When it was time for gifts, my mother announced it with the enthusiasm of someone unveiling a grand performance. Brianna sat cross-legged on the floor near the coffee table, surrounded by brightly wrapped packages and holding a glass of wine. One by one, she opened them, an expensive candle set from our cousin, a trendy cookbook from a friend, a gift card to her favorite cafe from our aunt and uncle. Our parents handed her a set of wireless earbuds, not top of the line, but a solid choice nonetheless. Finally, she reached for my gift. I felt a flicker of nerves as she tore the lavender wrapping. For a brief second, I saw her smile falter as she lifted the bracelet from the box. The room quieted, as though sensing a shift in the air. She held the bracelet between two fingers, examining it like it was something she'd found on the sidewalk. With a laugh that cut through the silence, she turned to the crowd and said, "My sister got me this cheap bracelet for my birthday. Is this some kind of joke?" I opened my mouth, trying to remind her about our agreement from Christmas, but my voice came out small and shaky. I said I thought she'd like something personal, with the charm for her initial. She waved the bracelet dismissively and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, that she didn't need charity, that she expected more from her only sister. My parents, who I'd hoped would intervene, simply stood there. My mother actually nodded along with Brianna's complaints, saying maybe I should have made an exception this one time. I felt like I was standing outside my own body, watching the scene unfold as everyone stared at me. The bracelet slipped from Brianna's fingers, bounced off my chest, and fell to the floor. My father stepped toward me and, in a low voice meant only for me, told me to pack up and leave before I embarrassed myself further. That was the moment I realized I had no place there. Not really, not the way I had always tried to convince myself I did. I bent down, picked up the bracelet, and left without another word. The drive back to my apartment was a blur. The second I closed my front door behind me, I let myself collapse onto the couch. The tears came in waves, not just from the humiliation of that night, but from the years of small cuts that led to this point. Brianna had always been the golden child, the one whose mistakes were forgiven, whose whims were indulged. I had spent my whole life trying to be the dependable one, the sensible one, the one who kept the peace even when it cost me everything. That night, I made myself a cup of tea, stared at the bracelet on my coffee table, and felt something inside me shift. I realized that I was done trying to earn their approval. I was done playing a role in a family drama where I was always cast as the villain, no matter what I did. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for the realtor I'd been working with. It was late, but I didn't care. I needed to move forward. I needed to find something that was mine, something no one could take from me or belittle. When he answered, I told him I was ready to look at apartments again, ready to start fresh. And for the first time in a long time, I actually meant it. The morning after that disastrous birthday party, I woke up feeling hollow, as though someone had reached inside my chest and taken something I hadn't even known I treasured. The humiliation still burned fresh in my mind, replaying in loops as I stared at the ceiling of my small, rented apartment. I thought about all the times I'd tried to bridge the distance between Brianna and me, about the careful words I'd chosen over the years to avoid setting her off, and about the countless times I'd let her insults slide to keep the peace. I realized then that none of it had ever mattered. The truth was that no matter how hard I tried, I would never be enough in her eyes, or in my parents' either. That afternoon, I met with Ryan, my realtor, who had been patiently helping me search for my first home for nearly 2 months. I told him I was ready to see something different, something that felt like a real fresh start rather than just another apartment. Ryan listened without judgment, his kind expression making me feel, for the first time that week, like I wasn't completely alone. He mentioned that a unit in Cambridge had just hit the market that morning, one he hadn't mentioned before because he hadn't thought it fit my earlier search criteria. But now, everything felt different, and I told him I wanted to see it immediately, even if it wasn't what I thought I was looking for. When we pulled up to the building later that afternoon, my heart skipped a beat. It was a renovated brick warehouse, one of those hidden gems that combined old-world character with modern comforts. The building had large industrial windows, wrought iron balconies, and ivy creeping up one side in a way that somehow made it look both sturdy and romantic. Inside, we took an old freight elevator up to the third floor, and Ryan unlocked the door to a corner unit that seemed to glow with natural light. The second I stepped inside, I felt it, that sense of rightness I hadn't found in any of the sleek, sterile apartments we'd toured before. The apartment had soaring ceilings with exposed beams that gave the space warmth and charm. Sunlight poured in through the huge windows, casting golden stripes across the hardwood floors. The kitchen was open, with concrete countertops and a rustic wooden island that made me want to cook, even though I wasn't much of a chef. There was a small balcony that overlooked a tree-lined street where people were walking dogs and chatting over coffee at a little cafe on the corner. The bedroom was cozy but had a walk-in closet that made me gasp in delight. I had never had a walk-in closet before, and I could already picture myself arranging my clothes and shoes, creating a space that was entirely mine. Ryan gave me space to wander through the apartment twice, and each time I found another detail to love: the vintage-style fixtures in the bathroom, the small nook that would make a perfect workspace, the quiet energy of the place that made me feel safe. When I finally stopped and looked at him, he smiled and asked if I wanted to make an offer. Without hesitation, I said yes. I didn't care that it was a little over my original budget, because for the first time, I felt like I wasn't just buying a place to live. I was claiming a piece of the world where I could belong without having to prove anything to anyone. The next 2 weeks flew by in a blur of paperwork, inspections, and phone calls. The seller was eager to move quickly, having been transferred overseas on short notice, so everything moved at lightning speed. My offer was accepted within hours. My mortgage was approved in record time thanks to my solid credit and large down payment. And before I could even catch my breath, I was holding the keys to my new apartment. I wanted so badly to share my excitement with someone, but when I reached for my phone, I stopped myself. I realized there was no one in my family I wanted to call. Instead, I shared the news with friends and coworkers who had always been supportive, who celebrated my happiness without conditions or criticism. I spent every free moment after work and on weekends turning my new apartment into a home. I scoured local shops and online stores for furniture that suited the space. A deep green velvet sofa that made the living room feel inviting, a reclaimed wood dining table that anchored the open kitchen, and vintage bar stools that added character to the island. I splurged on a king-sized bed, the first I'd ever owned, and found curtains in a soft oatmeal color that framed the windows without blocking the sunlight. Each piece I chose felt like a small act of defiance, a way of saying, "This is my life now, and I'll build it on my terms." Once everything was in place, my friend Layla insisted that I host a housewarming party. I hesitated at first, the sting of my family's rejection still fresh, but she reminded me that this was my chance to fill my home with people who truly cared about me. I kept the guest list small, just close friends, a few coworkers, and my neighbor from across the hall who had already shown herself to be kind and welcoming. I didn't invite a single family member. As much as part of me felt guilty about it, I reminded myself that they had made no effort to reach out or apologize in the weeks since Brianna's party. The night of the party, my apartment was filled with laughter, music, and warmth. My friends brought small, thoughtful gifts, a potted herb garden, a set of handmade coasters, a bottle of wine with a funny label that made us all laugh. We took pictures, toasted with sparkling wine, and stayed up late sharing stories and dreams. For the first time in years, I felt free of the weight I'd carried for so long. The next morning, still glowing from the joy of the night before, I shared a few photos on social media, proud of the space I had created. I didn't expect what would come next, the storm that was about to hit when my family finally realized that I had moved on without them. It didn't take long after I posted those photos for the piece I'd been enjoying to shatter. The following Monday, right as I was wrapping up a meeting at work, my phone started buzzing on my desk. When I glanced at the screen and saw my mother's name, my stomach dropped. For a brief second, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity and dread made me answer. My mother's voice was sharp and cold, not bothering with pleasantries or even a polite greeting. She went straight for the attack, demanding to know when I had planned to tell them that I had bought an apartment. Her tone was so accusatory that it took me a second to find my voice. I calmly pointed out that after what had happened at Brianna's birthday, I hadn't felt much like sharing my good news. My mother scoffed, as if the entire scene at the party had been some harmless misunderstanding rather than the humiliating experience it had been for me. She insisted that I was overreacting and claimed that families didn't keep secrets like this from one another. The nerve of her words made my blood boil. But I kept my voice steady and reminded her that I had been the one forced out of their house that night, not the other way around. The call ended with me making an excuse about work, needing to hang up before I said something I'd regret. I barely had time to take a breath before my phone buzzed again. This time it was Brianna. I let it ring, unwilling to get dragged into whatever self-centered tantrum she was surely about to throw. When I ignored her call, she tried again and again. Finally, the messages started. They came fast, each one more outrageous than the last. Brianna demanded to know how I could justify spending money on an apartment while giving her what she called a pathetic gift. She actually wrote that I owed her now, that I should send her at least $3,000 as a real birthday present to make up for the bracelet. I stared at my screen, stunned by her audacity. The entitlement dripping from every word left me speechless, though not surprised. The barrage didn't stop with her. Soon, messages from my mother and even my father started rolling in. They accused me of being selfish, deceitful, and heartless for leaving them out of this major life event. The hypocrisy was staggering, considering none of them had cared about my feelings during or after that awful night at Brianna's party. By the end of that week, I was exhausted. Every ding of my phone filled me with dread, knowing it would be another guilt trip, another accusation, another demand. I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I sat down at my new desk, the one I had so carefully chosen for my apartment's little office nook, and composed 3 separate emails. One went to my mother, one to my father, and one to Brianna. I took my time with the wording, wanting to be clear but firm. I explained that I needed space, that their behavior both at the birthday and afterward had made it clear they didn't respect me or my boundaries. I told them that until they could acknowledge how they had hurt me, I didn't want further contact. Sending those emails felt like taking a deep, cleansing breath after holding it for far too long. For a couple of days, things were blissfully quiet. I almost let myself believe that they might actually respect my request. But of course, that peace didn't last. It was early on a Saturday when loud, aggressive knocking jolted me out of my morning routine. I had been sipping coffee and reading in the living room, finally starting to feel settled, when I looked through the peephole and saw them, my mother, my father, and Brianna, standing there like a united front of judgment. For a moment, I considered pretending I wasn't home, but I knew they'd probably just keep showing up, and I didn't want to spend my weekend hiding in my own home. I opened the door, leaving the security chain latched, and asked how they'd found my address. My mother smirked and said that my cousin had given it to them, as if that made it perfectly acceptable to barge in uninvited. She insisted that they needed to talk and demanded to be let in. Against my better judgment, I opened the door fully and let them inside. The second they stepped over the threshold, they started looking around, their eyes sweeping over the space with thinly veiled disdain. My mother muttered something about the apartment being interesting, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Brianna crossed her arms and gave me that familiar, condescending look that always made me feel small. She accused me of using my apartment as an excuse for giving her a cheap gift, as if the two things were somehow connected. I calmly told her that I could afford a thoughtful gift, which I had given her, and that she was the one who had rejected it. The conversation spiraled quickly, with my mother and father insisting that I was the one blowing things out of proportion. They claimed that my emails had been dramatic and unnecessary, that this whole situation could have been resolved if I had just invited them to my housewarming and acted like nothing had happened. I stood there, listening to their revisionist version of events, and felt a strange sense of clarity. For so long, I had doubted myself, wondered if I was overreacting. But hearing their words now, I knew I wasn't. I was simply tired of being gaslit, tired of being made to feel like the villain for wanting to be treated with respect. I asked them to leave. When they protested, I repeated myself more firmly, saying that I needed space and that I wouldn't continue this conversation until they could admit how they had hurt me. The idea of apologizing seemed to stun them into silence, as if I had spoken in a foreign language. After a long pause, they finally left, with my mother throwing over her shoulder that this wasn't over. And in that moment, I knew she was right. This was far from over, but I was done playing their games on their terms. The days that followed their unwelcome visit were as draining as they were predictable. My phone didn't stop buzzing, not with well-meaning relatives hoping to mediate, nor with guilt-laced messages from my parents. My Aunt Lydia sent a long text insisting that my mother was heartbroken and that I should forgive and forget. My Uncle Robert chimed in with a message about how family must always come first, no matter what. Even cousins I barely spoke to suddenly felt entitled to weigh in, urging me to let go of my so-called grudge for the sake of family unity. The barrage of messages came at all hours, filling my notifications with relentless pressure to reconcile on their terms. I tried my best to ignore the noise, but after a week of constant pokes and prods, I set filters on my email and started silencing calls from numbers I didn't recognize. The worst part wasn't their persistence. It was the way their words made me question myself. Late at night, after I'd put down my phone and turned off the lights, I'd lie awake wondering if I was being too harsh or too stubborn. I kept replaying that awful birthday party, their smug faces in my apartment, and the venom behind Brianna's texts. Each time, I reminded myself that I had every right to set boundaries, but years of conditioning made it hard to silence the inner voice that whispered doubt. Layla noticed something was off when we met for coffee one Saturday afternoon. I tried to put on a brave face, but the exhaustion must have been plain to see. She asked gently if everything was okay, and before I could stop myself, the whole story came pouring out. I told her about the birthday disaster, the cruel ambush at my apartment, the relentless family campaign to guilt-trip me into submission. I admitted how much I hated the tension, but couldn't go back to pretending everything was fine. Layla listened quietly, letting me vent until I finally trailed off, feeling empty and exposed. When I finished, she looked me straight in the eye and said something that finally cut through all the noise. She told me that being family didn't give people the right to mistreat or manipulate me. She said that setting boundaries wasn't cruelty, it was survival. For the first time in weeks, I felt seen. That conversation stayed with me long after I left the cafe, and it gave me the strength to keep holding my ground. The onslaught from my family began to slow, though not because they'd accepted my position. I suspected they had grown tired of my silence, or perhaps they realized their usual tactics weren't working. My parents shifted strategies, sending casual, breezy texts as if nothing had happened at all. My mother sent a photo of a coffee mug with the message, "Saw this and thought of you." My father asked how work was going, as if the last few months hadn't been filled with tension and hostility. I replied politely, but briefly, refusing to fall back into the pattern of sweeping everything under the rug. Brianna, on the other hand, made no effort to reach out directly. Instead, she took her grievances to social media, posting thinly veiled rants about so-called toxic people who played the victim while tearing families apart. Her words were vague enough that only those who knew the backstory would understand, but biting enough that I couldn't mistake the target. I didn't engage, knowing that any response would only feed the fire. I kept my head down, focused on work, and filled my free time with things that brought me genuine joy. I planted herbs on my balcony, joined a neighborhood book club, and even agreed to go on a few dates set up by a coworker. It was nearly 4 months after I moved in when something unexpected happened. One evening, as I sorted through emails, I spotted a message from Brianna. The subject line was simple: "I've been thinking." My heart raced as I clicked it open, bracing for another attack. But what I found surprised me. Brianna admitted that she had started therapy at the urging of a friend, and that her therapist had pointed out patterns she'd never considered before. She confessed that she'd initially been offended at the idea that she might struggle with entitlement or jealousy, but over time, she'd started to see the truth in it. She said she wasn't ready to say she was wrong about everything, but she was beginning to understand my perspective and hoped we could talk. I stared at the message for a long time, unsure how to feel. It wasn't the apology I'd dreamed of, but it was more reflection than I'd ever seen from her. After sitting with it overnight, I wrote back to say that I was open to meeting, but only in a neutral space, not at my apartment or our parents' house. We settled on a quiet cafe on a Sunday morning. The meeting was awkward, filled with long silences and hesitant words, but it was honest. Brianna admitted she'd always felt like she had to compete with me, that she'd grown used to being the favored one and hadn't known how to cope when I asserted myself. She said she was sorry about how she'd handled the bracelet and that, looking back, it had been a lovely, thoughtful gift. We didn't hug when we left the cafe, and we didn't promise to talk every day, but it was a start. I left feeling hopeful, though cautious, knowing we had a long way to go before we could rebuild trust. My parents remained unchanged, continuing to act as though the past hadn't happened, sending invitations to family dinners and casual messages without ever acknowledging the hurt they'd caused. Each time, I reminded myself that I could control my own boundaries, even if I couldn't change them. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was living life on my own terms, with people who valued and respected me. That was enough, at least for now. Life settled into a rhythm after that cautious meeting with Brianna, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I truly began to feel like my apartment was more than just a place to live. It was my sanctuary. I spent weekends wandering through farmers markets, trying new recipes in my cozy kitchen, and filling my space with small details that made it feel like home. The little balcony became my favorite spot in the evenings, where I'd sip tea as the sun dipped behind the buildings and the city lights began to glow. I stopped waiting for my phone to buzz with another guilt-laden message or for some relative to try and mediate on behalf of my parents. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to breathe deeply and believe that maybe, just maybe, I was finally free of their constant demands. But of course, nothing in my life with them was ever that simple. One Tuesday morning, as I was settling into my desk at work, I received a call from Ryan, my realtor. His voice was polite, but there was an edge of confusion I could hear beneath the professionalism. He said he'd received an inquiry from someone interested in my apartment, a cash buyer who was offering well over the market value, nearly $100,000 above what similar units were selling for in the neighborhood. I felt a jolt of disbelief, wondering who in their right mind would make such an offer for a place I'd barely owned for half a year. Ryan said the buyer wanted a quick sale and was ready to make the process as smooth as possible if I was interested. I laughed at first, assuming it was some investor with more money than sense, looking to flip the place or turn it into yet another short-term rental. I thanked Ryan for the call and said I wasn't interested, because the thought of leaving my apartment, this home I'd fought so hard for, didn't sit right. But later that evening, as I was chatting with my neighbor across the hall, I learned something that stopped me cold. Apparently, Brianna had a new boyfriend, a wealthy man named Travis, who had been bragging to people about helping her upgrade her life. My neighbor mentioned, almost offhand, that she'd overheard Brianna talking about wanting my apartment, wanting to be in the city, wanting to finally have what she called the better life she deserved. It didn't take long for me to connect the dots. That ridiculous offer hadn't come from some anonymous investor. It had come from Travis, no doubt orchestrated by Brianna, who must have decided that since she couldn't humiliate me or control me, she'd simply try to take what I had built for myself. The realization made my stomach turn, a bitter mixture of anger and disappointment settling heavy in my chest. I could picture them, sitting together and planning how to erase my victory, as if my happiness was just another thing they could buy or manipulate. I didn't respond to the offer, and instead I reached out to the condo board, sharing what I'd learned. I explained that there might be an attempt to purchase units under false pretenses or through shady deals, and I wanted them to be aware. To my relief, they took my concerns seriously and began looking into the matter. Within a few weeks, rumors began to swirl that Travis's business dealings were not as clean as he portrayed, and soon, he found himself under scrutiny from more than just the condo board. Whatever plans he and Brianna had been cooking up fell apart in the light of day, and their picture-perfect romance began to crumble right along with them. Brianna tried once more to contact me, sending a long, rambling email about how everything had gone wrong, how Travis had turned out to be someone she didn't recognize, and how she missed having a sister she could talk to. There was a time when that message would have tugged at my heartstrings, would have made me question whether I was being too harsh or unforgiving. But as I read her words, I felt nothing but a deep, steady calm. I realized that, for the first time, I didn't feel responsible for fixing things, for smoothing over the mess she'd made of her own life. I didn't even bother to reply. I simply closed my laptop, stepped out onto my balcony, and watched as the city carried on, alive and indifferent to the dramas I had left behind. Months passed, and my apartment became a symbol of everything I'd built for myself. Not just a physical space, but a testament to the boundaries I'd learned to set and the life I'd chosen to create. The friends who had supported me through it all became my true family, showing up for me in ways my blood relatives never had. My parents continued to send the occasional text or invitation, always pretending that nothing had happened, that there was no rift to address, no apology to be made. I responded politely but distantly, never giving them more than I was willing to spare. The final twist came on a chilly autumn evening, nearly a year after I had moved in. I was sitting in my living room, flipping through a book, when my phone buzzed with a message from Ryan. He had some news, he said, and wanted to call if I had a moment. Curious, I told him to go ahead. His voice was cautious but relieved as he explained that Travis had quietly tried to make another offer on my apartment through a third party, one that had been flagged immediately thanks to the alert I'd placed with the board. Apparently, Travis's financial troubles had deepened, and he was desperate for any foothold that could bolster his crumbling image. The board had formally blacklisted him from purchasing any property in the building, and legal action was being considered for the fraudulent attempts. I thanked Ryan and hung up, feeling the last weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying finally lift from my shoulders. It was over. The games, the manipulations, the constant push to control me, all of it had fallen apart, not because I'd fought back with drama or confrontation, but because I'd quietly held my ground and refused to let them pull me into their chaos. That night, I stood at my window, looking out over the lights of the city, and I felt a sense of peace deeper than any I'd known. This was my life, my space, my victory, and no one would ever take that from me again.